Hello and good evening, and welcome to a video tutorial on OSPFv3, and specifically we're going to be taking a look at the new OSPFv3 Address Family configuration mode. A lot of learners are curious about the differences between OSPFv2 and OSPFv3 from a configuration perspective, and hopefully this video is going to clear up some of that confusion. So as you can see, we have our topology that you, if you've watched any of my other videos, would be familiar with in terms of we have these three routers here. We have one router that's running iOS 15.3, another one that's running 15.3, and then we have sort of our legacy router here, which is still running the 12.4.24 code. And so what we're going to do is we're also going to see that with the new OSPFv3 configuration, that you cannot do it on this version of 12.4 code. And so we'll do the legacy IPv4 and IPv6 configuration here. Here we're going to do the IPv4 and IPv6 as separate entities. Right, we'll do it as separate entities. And then on router 6, we're going to go ahead and use OSPFv3 with the address families to run both IPv4 and IPv6. And again, remember that with OSPFv3, leveraging the address family is very similar to when you're doing multi-protocol BGP, or now when you're doing EIGRP in 64-bit mode, which is also referred to as named mode, you use address families. And they take a little bit of getting used to, but I have to admit that I wasn't a fan initially, but once I got into the syntax and was able to do some configuring, I definitely like the output that you get when you do a show run and look at section OSPF or section EIGRP or section BGP. So I've already configured all of the loopback interfaces on each of these routers, as well as all of the transit networks, and the transit networks being defined as the networks between the routers here. So everything is set up and ready to go. So let's go ahead and jump in, and we'll go ahead and start on router 5. And on router 5, we're going to use the legacy IPv4 and IPv6 setup. So I'm going to go from user exec into privilege exec. From privilege exec, we'll go into global config. I've actually enabled, should have enabled IPv6 unicast routing, right? Because we're going to be doing some IPv6 routing. So I'll just run that command again to make sure. So again, the legacy way to do IPv4 is to say router OSPF1, router OSPF1, and that's our one is our process ID, and that puts us sort of into the global OSPF configuration. And from here, we can do all kinds of stuff. So I can type in log adjacency changes if I want to make sure I see the see any changes between neighbors. I can go ahead and set the auto cost reference bandwidth, right? And let's just set the reference bandwidth here to, and we've got a serial link, so we'll just set it to a terabit, right? So we'll say 123, right? So we'll change the reference bandwidth, and it's going to have us change it across the board, and that's okay. We're gonna go ahead and do that. Let's see if BFD is supported. So BFD is supported, so bidirectional forward detection, and we'll say all interfaces. All right, so we've got BFD on, and then we want to set the router ID, right? So for router 5, we'll just simply set it to the loopback 0 address, which is 5.5.5.5. And again, as you can see here with legacy OSPFv2, which is IPv4, and IPv4 only, I'm doing the majority of my configuration here under the global configuration mode. So I could even say network, and let's enable OSPF on one of the interfaces, and this is one of the ways to activate OSPF on an interface, and we'll say 10.45.45.0 and then 0.0.0.255, and everything will be in area 0 this evening. So that's going to enable the OSPF process on interface serial 010. So the other way that we could do this with the legacy OSPFv2 for IPv4 is to simply go under the interface. So I'll say interface FA00, and I'll say IP OSPF1 area 0. So the IP OSPF1 matches sort of the router global config setup that we did with process ID 1, and then I'm going to put that interface into area 0 as well. So that is how you do the legacy configuration, right? So if I do a do show run section OSPF, you can see that what we're going to see here is this is the setting that we just set under interface FA00 to enable the OSPF process on that interface. Then we came into the global config mode here, right? Router OSPF1. We set the router ID. We're going to log adjacency changes. We set the autocost reference bandwidth to a terabit. And we use the network statement to activate the OSPF process on the 10.45.45.0 or on any interface within this range. And that's going to be the serial 010 interface. And then we turn on bidirectional forwarding on all interfaces. So right now on router 5, we've completed the legacy OSPFv2 configuration for IPv4. And again, we looked at two different ways to activate the OSPF process on a router interface. So let's go ahead now and let's go ahead and do our IPv6 configuration for OSPF. And now we're going to use, and it seems very early in the game with IPv6 to say legacy, but this is definitely the legacy way to do it without address families. And so if I were to do the IPv6 configuration like the way I'm going to do it right here on router 5, you would have to do the OSPF v2 IPv4 configuration like we just did it. So they're kind of like, this is sort of the dual stack, right, as we're going to do the IPv4 configuration and the IPv6 configuration. And they're going to be separate configurations. So what I would end up saying is, let me exit out here. I'm going to say router OSPFv3, and if I put the question mark, I apologize. So IPv6 router, and we're going to do OSPF, and then I'm going to put in the process ID, right? And so I'll say process ID 1. And so again, this is the legacy way to configure IPv6 on a Cisco router. And once I've entered in the IPv6 router OSPF1, if I enter the question mark, you'll notice very, very similar commands under the OSPF IPv6 process as just like we had with the OSPF IPv4 process. So let's go ahead and set some of the same things. I'll set the router ID to 5.5.5.5. And again, remember that even with OSPF IPv6, the router ID still takes the form, and they even tell you right here, in IP address format, but it's in IPv4 address format, right? It's not IPv6 address format. So the router ID stays the same as IPv4 format. So let me back up over that. We'll go ahead and set our autocost reference bandwidth out to 123 to 1,000,000, and we'll make sure we do that across the board. And then we're going to go ahead and what else did we do? We had log adjacency changes, and you'll notice there's no network statement here, right? Because with the legacy IPv6 or OSPFv3 for IPv6, the only way to turn it on OSPF on an interface is to actually go to the interface, right? So again, that's one of the differences between the OSPFv2 for IPv4 and the legacy OSPFv3 for IPv6 configuration setup. So we've got our adjacency changes in there. So if I do a do show run section OSPF, let's see what we see now. So again, that's our OSPF statement under the interface that we set up for IPv4. Here's our IPv4 configuration with the network statement. and we want to go ahead and do BFD. And that actually wasn't even a choice there, was it? I don't believe. Yeah, it's not a choice. So, but we've got it on under the global config for IPv4, and then we have our IPv6 config, right? Router ID, we're going to log adjacency changes. We've got our reference bandwidth set. So let's go ahead now, and for IPv6, let's enable OSPF on serial 010. And so to do this, and this is the legacy way, is IPv6, OSPF with the process ID, and then the area. So very similar to the legacy OSPFv3 configuration under an interface. The only difference between this command for IPv6 and the IPv4 command is simply that. We say IPv6 instead of IP, just simply IP. So I would type in IPv6 OSPF1 area 0, and I would hit enter. And then I'm going to go under interface fast Ethernet 00 and run the exact same command. IPv6 OSPF1 area 0. Now you'll notice we don't have any adjacencies establishing yet, and that's because we haven't configured OSPF on any of the neighbor routers. So also what we're going to do now is I'm going to go into interface loopback 10, and we're going to say the same thing. IPv6 OSPF1 area 0. Whoops. And I will say, once I get this command correct, IP OSPF1 area 0. So we're going to go ahead and enable OSPF on the loopback interfaces that we have here so that we can see some routes being exchanged. So again, interface loopback 11, IPv6 OSPF1 area 0, and then IP OSPF1 area 0. And this is going to make these loopback addresses visible throughout the OSPF domain. So interface loopback 12, IP OSPF1 area 0, and then IPv6 OSPF1 area 0. All right, so that completes our configuration. In fact, let me make sure I don't forget loopback 0, IP OSPF1 area 0, and IPv6 OSPF1 area 0. So now we've got OSPF fully configured here. If I do a do show IP OSPF, right, you can see the process is up. If I do a do show IPv6 OSPF, you can see that the OSPF is running both IPv4 and IPv6, right? So let's go ahead and do a do show run, or actually a do show IP OSPF interfaces. And so you can see here all of the interfaces that are running the IPv4 protocol. If I come back and simply change it to IPv6 OSPF interfaces, here are all of our OSPFv3 interfaces, or OSPFv3 on which IPv6 is running, the OSPFv3 is running IPv6 on these interfaces as well. Okay. So we've got router 5 configured here, and again, that was the legacy way to do both OSPFv2 and OSPFv3. So let's get to the new config, the new method to configure the address family mode for OSPFv3, right? And so we're actually going to go ahead, and I said separate here, and let me go ahead and we're going to pull this off. So we're going to use the address families, and we're going to do it like you would if you were doing it with the new configuration format with the address families. So I'm going to go from user exec to privilege exec into global config, and so here's where the configuration with OSPF with the new address family mode is definitely different from the legacy method. And so remember, we said that we can run both IPv4 and IPv6 under the same OSPFv3 process. And so here's how you do that. So I'm going to say router OSPFv3 and then my process ID, and I'll simply say process ID 1. So let's do a question mark here because we're going to see some new options. You'll notice here is the address family option right here, right? We can globally set the router ID for both address families, right? We can set passive interface if we wanted to, and we are going to be setting this. We've also got bidirectional forward detectioning, right? So for BFD. So let's go ahead, log adjacency change as well. So let's go ahead and set some of these things up right now. And again, so I'm really in the global sort of configuration area here, where any configurations I make here are going to be inherited by both of the address families. So let's go ahead and say log adjacency changes. I'm going to say, we'll go passive interface default, right? So that I have to actually say no passive interface for the interfaces I want it to run on. We'll say BFD all interfaces. And let's see what else is that. I think that's pretty much everything we did. Oh, auto cost reference bandwidth. Sorry about that. So auto cost reference bandwidth, we'll set that out to a terabit. Is that right? 123. Okay, there we go. We've got 1,000,000. Okay, and so that's going to be good for us right there. So now let's take a look at the address families. So you can see we have an IPv4 address family and an IPv6 address family. So let's do our IPv4 configuration first, right? So address family IPv4 and unicast. So the IPv4 is the AFI, right? The address family identifier. And unicast is referred to as the SAFI, right? And I believe it's the subsequent address family identifier. So we're saying it's IPv4 and we're going into unicast, right? There are no VRFs involved here. So I'll go ahead and hit enter, right? And let's take a look at what we could set underneath the address family configuration. So you'll notice that router ID is here. So if we were to set a router ID here for the IPv4 address family, it would override the global setting. BFD is in here as well, but if I were to do a do show run section OSPF, you can see that we've got a lot of the settings that we had set above us, the BFD, the auto cost reference bandwidth. I thought I had set log adjacency changes. We'll set that here. And let's make sure we get that. And there we go. All right, so under IPv4, that's where we would set it. If we were doing any kind of redistribution, right? If I wanted to redistribute the connected routes or redistribute other routes for that matter, then I would do my redistribution here. I could also, if I wanted to do the default information originate, right? That would be a command that I would run here. So what we're going to do is we'll go ahead and leave the IPv4 address family the way it is. I'm going to exit up one level, and then I'm going to say address family IPv6, and again our choices are unicast or VRF. So I'll say unicast, and you'll notice the reference bandwidth has changed because we had set it up globally. So let's go ahead and say, what did we set above previously? It was, we'll do log adjacency changes. So if I do a do show run on section OSPF now, you can see here that we've got sort of our overarching config, right? Which is going to impact both address families. So consider this as kind of like the global OSPF configuration, and then we break it down into the IPv4 unicast address family, and we're logging adjacency changes, and then we have the IPv6 unicast section, right? So we've turned on the OSPFv3 process using the new configuration method. So if I were to go back to router 5, and this is running 12.4 24T8 code. If I were to go into global config and say router OSPFv3 and a question mark, you'll notice it's an unrecognized command. So if I go back to router, those are my choices. So even with the 12.4 code, which isn't that old, you cannot do the new OSPFv3 configuration, right? And again, I'm running 15.3 code. I would actually have to load some older 15.1, 15.2 to see where exactly they activated it. But with 15.3 code, which is very recent code, I know 15.4 is out, the new OSPFv3 configuration mode is available to you, and it's actually not difficult to pick up, and it's actually very easy to configure and a little easier to read as well. All right, so we've configured the overall process. I think we said, what was I going to do? I was going to do, was it passive interface default? Yeah, I think I was going to set passive interface default. And so if we were to say do show run section OSPF, you'll notice that the passive interface default was actually placed for us automatically under each address family. So let's go back into address family IPv4 unicast, and I'm going to say no passive interface, and we're on router 4, so no passive interface FA00 and no passive interface serial 010, because we definitely want those interfaces to be running OSPF. So now let's go ahead and back out one level and go into address family IPv6 unicast, and we'll say the same thing. And maybe I can recall them. There we go. And FA00. So now let's take a look. Do show run section OSPF. All right, so as you can see, it really builds out nicely for you. So we've got our address family IPv4 unicast set up and configured, and we have our address family IPv6 unicast set up and configured. We've got passive interface default, and then we've activated the two interfaces that we want for both IPv4 and IPv6. And again, the nice thing here is on router 5, remember, we had to do router OSPF1 and then do the IPv4 configuration, and then we had to start up a completely separate section to configure the v6, and that was where we used the IPv6 router OSPF. And again, that was legacy on router 5. Here is the new command, and again, I'm running 15.3, where you can actually configure OSPF as address families. And so we're actually going to do this. I'm going to grab all of this, right? Because you'll notice that's also something that's nice. I can just basically say copy, and actually now that I look at it, we've got, I may have to tweak the passive interfaces, but I'll be able to copy and paste this onto router 6 to save us a little configuration time. So now, with OSPFv3, the new configuration format, you'll notice there was no network statement. So the same rule applies, that I need to actually go to the interface to activate OSPF on that interface. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll start out first with interface serial 010, and if I do a do show run int on serial 010 so that you can see what it looks like, we've got a link local address, and we have our IPv4 address, right? And that's really all the configuration that we have on here. So here's what we want to do now. We're going to say OSPFv3, right? And remember, when we did that router OSPFv3, so now we're saying OSPFv3, and we're going to use next is going to be the process ID number, right? And you can see right there that that's one of the top, it's the top choice. So we ran process ID 1, and then I'm going to do a question mark, and we're going to say, I believe it's area, area 0, IPv4, right? So what's interesting is you'll notice, and again, this 15.3 code that I'm using here, this is, I don't want to say, I guess experimental might be the good word, but it's basically, it's a development code string, and it's definitely not a production code string. And you'll notice that when I typed in OSPFv3 1 and then did the question mark, you don't see an option here for area, although it took the command. So there is an IPv4 option, which is then followed by area, and then we could put the area in. So if I do a do show run interface serial 010, let's take a look at what that interface looks like right now. And we've got the OSPFv3 1 IPv4 area 0 on the serial 010 interface, And let's also go ahead and configure the IPv6 setting right now as well. And I'll go ahead and say OSPFv3 process ID is going to be 1. And if you do the question mark, you can see we can select IPv6. And then I can put the area in. And then I would put in area 0. And you can also put it in IP address format, but we don't have it in that format, right? So, and I'll type in OSPFv3 IPv6. So, as you can see there, we've got our neighbor adjacency just popped up with v6. So if I do a do show IPv6 route, what should we see? Yeah, we've got a bunch of OSPF routes that we've picked up. So let's take a look here. We've picked up from router 5, we've picked up router 5's loopback, right? That's the IPv6 on the loopback. We picked up the loopback from network 10, 11, and 12, right? So the IPv6 came up, but the IPv4 did not. So let's do a do show IP route OSPF, and we've got nothing right now. Do show IP route. Let's see what we've got. And that's it. We only have our connected interfaces, but the IPv6 came up right away, but IPv4 did not. So let's take a look at these interfaces. So do show run int serial 010. So we have our link local address, we've got our IPv4 address, and we've got the OSPFv3 1 IPv6 area 0 and the OSPFv3 IPv4 area 0, right? So let's go back on router 5 and let's take a look. As you can see here, the neighbor relationship came up. So if I do a do show run IPv6 route OSPF, oh, I apologize, do show run IPv6 route, and what am I doing? Oh, I'm on 5. So do show run IPv6, do show IPv6 route, sorry, IPv6 route. There we go. All right, so you can see here that we haven't actually picked up any of the routes from router 4, right? We've got no OSPF routes here, as you can see that, right? So there might be, and what I may be leading up to here is there may be a compatibility difference here, but let's continue on. Let's see what we've got going on. So do show run interface serial 010, right? So there's our setup, and you'll notice we've got the interface statement there for IPv6, and then the adjacency came up, and we also had it for IPv4, but the adjacency did not come up. So now let's go ahead and go to router 6. So we're going to leave IPv4 broken between 4 and 5 right now. So let's step over to router 6, and we'll go from privilege exec into global from user exec to privilege exec into global config. And we're going to go ahead and do the address family configuration here again, just like we did over on router 4. So let me get that output. So do show run section OSPF. All right, and so as you can see here, it's going to be convenient to simply grab that information. We'll come back to router 6, and I'm going to drop it in right here, but we've got some errors and the passive interface because there is no serial interface. So let's see what we're left with. So do show run section OSPF, and hopefully this is actually going to save us time. So there we go. So the serial command obviously gave us an error because there is no serial interface that's up on router 6. So now let me go ahead and we're going to go into address family IPv4 unicast. And I'm going to go ahead and say no passive interface and FA01. And so then we'll exit up one level and we'll say address family IPv6 unicast. And I'll say no passive on, and that's going to be interface FA0, or I'm sorry, no passive interface. Is that FA? Yeah, FA01. There we go. All right, so now if I do a do show run section OSPF, So there is our new OSPFv3 configuration for the IPv4 address family, as well as the IPv6 address family. So if I do on router 6 a do show run or a do show IPv6 interface brief, you can see we've got our loopback interfaces configured as well as link locals on fast Ethernet 00 and 01. If I do a do show IP interface brief, you can see that we're configured here as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and on router 6, let's go under the interfaces, including all of the loopback interfaces, and let's make our configuration changes. So I'm going to go ahead and say interface will start with loopback 0, and I'm going to go ahead and say OSPFv3, and then we've got that right, OSPFv3, and it's process ID 1, IPv4 for IPv4, and then we're going to say area, and our area is simply 0. And then I'm going to turn around and run the exact same command and simply say IPv6, right? So then as I go under interface loopback 10, and actually let me check do show run interface loopback 10. Okay, so we don't have these commands there yet. All right, so then I'm going to say OSPFv3, process ID 1 for IPv4 area 0, and then we'll pull the command back up and we'll do IPv6. We're going to go into interface loopback 11, and we're going to do the exact same thing. OSPFv3 1 for the process ID IPv4 area 0, and then pull the command back up and then say interface loopback 12 OSPFv3 process ID 1 for IP address family IPv4 area 0, and then for excuse me, for IPv6 we did interface loopback 0 already. So now let's go ahead and drop under the actual physical router interfaces. So we're going to hit interface FA01 first, and I'll say OSPFv3 process ID 1 IPv4 area 0, and we're going to pull it up and we'll do the same thing for IPv6, right? So OSPF has come up for, or I shouldn't say come up, but it's been configured now under FA01. So if I do a do show run on interface FA01, whoops, sorry, do show run int FA01, and you can see there we have our link local address and our IPv4 address with the OSPFv3 configuration under the interface mode. All right, so now let's go ahead and jump into interface FA0/0, and we're going to say OSPFv3 1 IPv6 area 0, and OSPFv3 1 IPv4 area 0, right? And so you can see the neighbor adjacency with IPv6 came up. So if I were to say do show IPv6 OSPF neighbors, you can see that we have a neighbor relationship with only router 5 and not excuse me, and not with router 4. However, as you can see here, if we were to do a do show run int on FA00 on router 4, this might be why the neighbor adjacency established between router 4 and router 6. So we're going to need to address this here really quick, and I'll say interface FA00, we'll say OSPFv3 process ID 1 IPv4 area 0, and we're going to do the same thing for OSPFv3 process ID 1 IPv6 area 0. And so we saw our adjacency come up right away for IPv4, and now it comes up right away for IPv6. So we saw there's some interesting stuff going on here, is that OSPF, and we'll explain why here in just a second. Let me go ahead and do show IP OSPF neighbors, and do show IPv6 OSPF neighbor. So there's our v6 relationships, right? You can see that we have a relationship, and this is from router 4's perspective, and this is with IPv6. We have a relationship with, or an adjacency, I should say, not relationship, adjacency with router 6 as well as with router 5. And I just noticed on router 6 that we probably did not set the, let's go into router OSPFv3. I don't think I set the router ID properly. Process ID 1, and let's do a do show run section OSPF. It might be from when I cut and pasted, and it doesn't look like I set the router ID at all. So router ID 6.6.6.6, and then we're going to definitely go ahead and do a do clear OSPFv3 proc, and I'm going to say yes. So our adjacencies are going to go down, and then they are going to come back up, and I'm going to say do show IPv6 OSPF neighbor. Do show IPv6, and I misspelled OSPF again, one of my more common typos. All right, so even on router 4, it looks like I need to go in and sort that out as well. So as you can see, though, here on router 6, right, which is running, and we'll come over here to the drawing. So on router 6, we're running the brand new and improved address family format. So the adjacency between 4 and 6, we're good with both IPv4 and IPv6, right? We got a check mark here. This is working great. But again, this is using sort of the new configuration mode. And let me erase this real quick here because we did not separate those out. There we go. All right, sorry about that. And so this is using the OSPFv3 address family, subsequent address family identifier, the AFI, SAFI format, right? So the adjacency here between IPv4 and IPv6 is up. However, this guy here, router 5, and we'll switch this to blue. So router 5, though, is running the 12.4 code. And as you can see, with router 5, the IPv6 is working, right? So if I were to do a do show IPv6 OSPF neighbor, so he sees router 6 and router 4. He's got an adjacency there. Let's take a look at some routes. Do show IPv6 route OSPF, right? So he's picking up, and I believe the reason that he's getting everything from 6 is if we were to go over to 4 and I were to do a do show run interface on loopback 0, yeah, we did not push these out. So what I would do is I would go into interface loopback 0, and I'm going to say, and again, we're using the new format here, right? And so the new format is OSPFv3, and then we're going to use the process ID area 0. Whoops. And let's see, let me make sure I've got this right here. And I'm on router 4. Yeah, what did I mess up there? OSPFv3, my process ID, I left something off. Oh, I'm sorry, IPv4. Just drawing a blank there. So IPv4 area 0, and then IPv6 area 0. And so now, if I were to come over to router 5 and rerun this command, we should see, and we do, right there, it's been advertised into OSPF as an intra-area route, right, as a /128. Here is the loopback address for loopback 0, right? And so let me pull all of the, so we'll go interface loopback 10, and we'll rerun both of those commands, IPv4 and IPv6, interface loopback 11, and IPv6 and IPv4 interface loopback 12, IPv4 and IPv6. Okay, so even when I'm on router 5, his IPv6, right, me being able to see his IPv6 routing information and the adjacency that's been established, so there they are. There are all of those loopback routes between routers 5 and 6 and 4 and 6. So the IPv6 is working, and it's working great, right? However, do show IP route, I'm not getting anything from either of the new OSPFv3 address family format. And the reason for this is because OSPFv3 was a complete rewrite of OSPFv2. They completely scrapped OSPFv2 and redid it all from scratch. And so with the legacy OSPFv2 configuration, it is not going to function with the newer OSPFv3 address family format, right? And so that's something to definitely keep in mind. And I've poked around a little bit, and I've been unable to find anything that points out a method or some kind of a command of some kind that would allow the two protocols, or I shouldn't say the two protocols, but the two versions of OSPF, v2 and v3, to run together, right? And so I'm going to basically make the statement that if you're using the legacy v4 OSPF v2, it is not going to establish adjacencies and work with routers where you're using the new OSPFv3 address family format, right? And again, that's a little different with the new 64-bit EIGRP. You can establish adjacencies with the legacy EIGRP, right, which is only 32-bit. So let's go ahead and recap here. Let's take a look real quickly and wrap this up. So do show run section OSPF, and you can see this is just these are the settings under the interfaces, and they show up, but this is what we're really interested in. So again, here is the syntax that I've used, right? We set BFD on all interfaces, we tweaked our auto cost reference bandwidth, and then we went into the address families. IPv4 unicast, IPv6 unicast. We did passive interface default, and then we turned it off on the interfaces where we wanted OSPF to run, and we're logging adjacency changes. And then again, we had to go under each of the interfaces and enable OSPFv3 process ID, which is 1 for the AFI, IPv6, and IPv4 for area 0. And I'm wondering, and I'm going to go ahead and do this right now. So if I were to say debug IP OSPF, and we're going to say capability, whoops. So I want to debug the capability advertisements, and this just popped into my head. And then let me grab this and run it on router 4. And I'm going to clear IP OSPF, IPv6 OSPF proc, and say whoops. So we'll say yes. And then we're going to clear IP OSPF proc. Okay, and I'm going to come back to 5, and I'm going to see if it receives from the debugs, if it's getting anything. Debug IP OSPF adjacency. We'll see if it sees anything. We clear the process. Let's see if router 5 gives us any information at all. No, it just simply shows the v3 process. Let me clear. So let's say clear IP, whoops, clear IP OSPF proc. And it's not actually clearing the process because we're running it under the v3 process. So I'm not actually getting any debugs here. But again, I'll update the description here under the YouTube channel if I can figure out a way to get the legacy OSPF v2 to work with the new OSPFv3 format. And again, I haven't been able to find anything to indicate that they can coexist, right? So that you would be able to implement this in an environment where you've got some legacy routers and you're going to expect the OSPFv3, the new format, right, to work with the old format. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up our video tutorial. And again, I really like the new address family format, especially since it's very similar to multi-protocol BGP. And it's very similar to the new EIGRP format, and this seems to be the direction that Cisco's heading. So remember, there's two different ways to do the IPv6 configuration. We looked at the legacy way on router 5. This is the new way here on routers 4 and 6. And you can run, as you see right here, you can run under the OSPFv3 process, you can run OSPF for IPv4 and OSPF for IPv6. All right, thanks for watching. Have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you soon.